Chuck Norris walked onto the range just as the sun climbed above the line of pine trees. The air smelled of fresh morning grass and spent gunpowder. He carried a simple black case in one hand and a small water bottle in the other. His shirt was as plain, his boots were worn, and his face showed no sign of surprise or worry. He looked like a man who had been on many journeys, but today he simply wanted to practice at the shooting range. Behind him, a group of 4 men and 2 women finished setting up their stations. They wore brand-name shooting vests, sleek ear protection, and carried modern rifles with scopes so large they looked like binoculars. One of the men, tall with a confident grin, nudged his friend. "Hey, look who's here," he said loud. Enough for Chuck to hear. Some guy with an old-school case. Bet he can't even hit the paper at 20 yards. Chuck paused at the sign that marked the rules. He glanced at it, then stepped forward and waved to the range officer, a middle-aged woman with a friendly face. She nodded and lifted his case onto the counter. While she checked his paperwork, Chuck took a slow drink of water and looked around. He noticed the target's downrange bright orange discs, steel plates, and a few moving targets on rails. He chose a spot by a wooden bench, laid down his case, and opened it. The rifle inside was clean and older in style. It had a simple iron sight rather than a fancy scope. The tall man who had mocked him leaned closer and pointed. "That gun is ancient." "Did your grandpa give it to you?" he laughed. His friends smiled at each other. One of the women flipped her hair and added, "Yeah, Grandpa's hunting rifle from the 60s. Chuck said nothing. He worked quietly. He lifted the rifle, checked the barrel, and loaded a magazine. His movements were calm, measured, and precise. He placed the rifle on the bench rest, then adjusted his stance. He was not in a hurry. Tall man walked over and looked down the range. "Watch this," he said to his friends. "I'm going to show you how it's done." He lifted his own rifle, a shiny new model, laid it in the rest, and fired 3 rounds. Each shot thudded into a paper target at 50 yards, leaving crisp holes in the center. The group cheered. The man turned to Chuck. "See? That's how you do it. You need the right gear and some real skill. This old-timer will be lucky to hit the water bucket at the end of the line." The target he meant was a small steel bucket. Nearly 100 yards away, turned back to the target and fired again. Another clean center hit. Shrugged and smiled at Chuck. Chuck stayed still for a moment. He lowered his head to the rifle, just enough to align the iron sights. The sun glinted off the metal. He drew a slow breath, held it, and squeezed the trigger. The shot rang out, echoing against the trees. The bullet struck the rim of the steel bucket with a ringing clang. It was not a center hit, but it rolled. Inside, the group fell silent. Their laughter died, replaced by puzzled looks. The tall man's smile froze. He stepped forward. "Did you just hit that with an iron sight?" he asked quietly. His friends gathered behind him, peering downrange. Chuck lifted his head. He did not smile. He racked the bolt, ejected the spent shell, and dropped in a fresh round. Took another. Slow breath, aimed again, and fired. The second shot rang true, splitting open the top of the bucket just where it had bent from the first shot. Metal shards sparkled in the sunlight. One of the women crossed her arms and muttered, "That has to be luck." The tall man ground his teeth and walked back to his bench. He loaded his rifle again, adjusted the scope, and fired 5 shots in quick succession. Each one hit the center of the paper at 50 yards, but the bucket downrange did not move. Chuck waited until the man's shots stopped. Then he reloaded his own rifle. He held it steady, looked down the simple sights, and fired 3 more rounds all at the bucket. Each time the bucket shook or rang. One shot even grazed the edge of the bucket's handle, bending it slightly. A hush settled over the range. The other shooters exchanged wide-eyed glances. The range officer, who had been tallying targets for another shooter, looked up. She saw Chuck's empty magazine and nodded in approval. She walked over and said in a low voice, "Nice grouping." Chuck nodded. He did not boast or raise his voice. He racked the bolt and looked back at the other shooters. The tall man lowered his scope and stared. He opened his mouth as if to speak, then closed it. One of the friends whispered something. To him, minutes passed. Chuck slowly placed the rifle back in its case, then reached for his water bottle. The group's leader finally spoke, stepped forward, cleared his throat, and said, I'm sorry for doubting you. His voice shook just a little. I thought you were some guy who didn't know his way around a gun, but that was amazing. Chuck smiled for the first time. It was a small smile, nothing grand, but it warmed the air. He stood and stretched, then offered his hand. The tall man shook it firmly, still staring. The other shooters came forward, one by one, murmuring apologies. The woman who had laughed first looked down, then met Chuck's eyes. She said softly, I didn't know iron sights could be that good. Chuck winked and said, never judge the tool by its age. It's the hand and the eye that matter. He patted the rifle case. Plus, I had plenty of practice. They asked him where he learned to shoot so well. Chuck only said here and there. He packed his case, slung it over his shoulder, and picked up his water bottle. It began. Walking toward the exit. The tall man called after him, Wait, please tell us, who are you? Chuck paused, glanced back, and smiled again. He rested his finger lightly on his lips, then pointed at the sky. The group watched as he lifted his case and strolled away, his boots stirring up small clouds of dust. Behind him, the metal bucket slowly settled on the ground. The range officer shook her head in wonder. By the time Chuck reached his car, the sun had climbed higher, casting long shadows. He loaded his case into the trunk, closed it, and stood for a moment looking at the range house. He thought of the early mornings, the empty fields, and the sound of gunfire at dawn. Remembered cold nights on distant hills, waiting for the right moment. Took a deep breath and felt the wind on his face. Then he climbed into his car and drove away, leaving behind a story the shooters would tell for years about the quiet man with the simple rifle who walked onto the range. Them laugh, and then showed them what true skill really means. ChatGPT said, Chuck Norris left the range with barely a nod, but behind him the shooters whispered among themselves. Their confident laughter had turned into stunned silence. As he walked down the gravel path, he felt the slight weight of curiosity pressing on his shoulders. He paused at the fence line, taking a moment to watch the target sway in the morning breeze. He remembered how different things had once been. Years earlier, long before he had ever carried that black case onto a civilian. Range Chuck had been deep inside the desert. He wore a dusty uniform, his face smeared with sweat and sand. The sun was a fierce judge, beating down without mercy. At night, he could hear the wind howl across empty dunes. He and his small team moved like shadows under a full moon, hunting a hidden enemy. There was no bragging back then, no eager onlookers to impress. Every shot had been a prayer for safety, every breath a chance to live another hour. The memory shifted to another time, in a land of ice and rock. The wind bit hard, and his breath came out as frosty clouds. He crawled through snowdrifts, rifle held tight, waiting for orders. There was a distant rumble, an enemy convoy lost. In the white emptiness, his finger hovered on the trigger, heart steady, even as his body trembled with cold. The shot rang out, loud as thunder, and the convoy slowed. He moved on, invisible against the frozen ground. There was no applause then, only the quiet crunch of snow under his boots. Back at the range, the shooters had no idea that the unassuming man with the simple rifle carried decades of experience in his steady hands. They did not know that every time he loaded a round, he recalled faces in far-off places, friends who had laughed around campfires, men who had stood beside him when the world seemed empty and the danger real. He had learned to trust the feel of the rifle's stock against his shoulder and the weight of the moment pressing against his mind. This calm readiness was exactly what he showed now. As he prepared to leave, one of the shooters stepped forward. It was the tall man who had first mocked him. His voice was soft, almost uncertain. Sir, he said, we've all been thinking. How did you learn to shoot like that? The others gathered close, their earlier arrogance replaced by genuine respect. Chuck looked at them, his eyes quiet and clear. He leaned against the fence, folding his arms. I trained for many years, he said. Learned from some of the best instructors in the world. He flicked a glance toward the targets. But most of all, I learned from my own mistakes. Every time I missed, I thought about what I could do better next time." He paused, then added practice and focus. "That is everything." One of the women who had laughed loudest before swallowed hard. "But sir, you make it sound so simple. You have scopes, tripods, and special sights. You had just iron sights." Chuck smiled slightly. "All the gadgets in the world can't replace a clear head," he said. "You have to calm your mind. You have to see the target as part of you, and the shot is just a matter of guiding the bullet home." The group listened, absorbing each word as if it were a lesson from an old master. Chuck noticed their sleeves some had brand logos stitched on, others had camo patterns stitched on. He could see their skill, but he also saw their need for more than just equipment. They needed confidence, calm. They needed to know how to steady their hearts as well as their rifles. He reached into his case and took out a small notebook. The cover was worn, pages yellowed. Opening it, he showed them neat handwriting and simple diagrams. "I keep a log of every session," he said. "Every miss, every hit. I write down the conditions, wind, light, distance. Then I write what I felt inside when I pulled the trigger." He closed the book and handed it to the tall man. "This helps me learn from each shot. You might try it yourself." The man turned the pages carefully. His eyebrows rose as he read. "You write every detail?" he asked. Chuck nodded. "If you remember the feeling when you shoot, you can find it again when you need it." The man handed the notebook back and stood in thoughtful silence. From behind, the range officer appeared. She carried 2 cups of coffee on a small tray. "For you, sir," she said, offering one. Chuck accepted it with a nod. The warm steam rose between them. She looked at the shooters. "I've been here 10 years, she said. "I've seen a lot of experts, but I've never seen someone pick up an iron sight rifle and do what he did this morning." She took a sip. "I thought you might like a cup." Chuck smiled more openly this time. He took a careful sip. The coffee was strong, bitter, and good. "Thank you," he said. The group waited as he finished. When he set the cup down, he said, "Keep practicing. Start simple. Work your way up. And remember, every master was once a beginner." One of the other women, younger and quieter, stepped forward. She held out her hand. "I'm Maria," she said softly. "Thank you for teaching us today." Chuck shook her hand. "Nice to meet you, Maria," he said. Then he looked at each person in turn. "You all have potential," he told them. "You just need to find your own way to focus." The shooters exchanged looks. Their earlier mockery felt like a dream, now strange and distant. They packed up their gear with more respect than before. They talked quietly about grouping and breathing and the weight of the trigger. Chuck watched them for a moment, then shouldered his own case. Before he walked away, he turned back once more. The sun was higher now, warming the benches and the blacktop. He looked at the targets, some still swaying from his shots. A few of the steel plates bore fresh dents. He felt a sense of satisfaction, but it was not pride. It was the calm of a job well done, of a lesson given that might help others find their own way. As he left, the group called after him. "Sir, will you come back? When can we learn more? Can we train with you?" Chuck paused, reached into his pocket, and pulled out a business card. It was simple. His name, a phone number, and the words "Private Instructor." He handed it to the tall man. "Call me if you're serious," he said, and he walked down the path, stepping over small stones and patches of grass. The shooters watched until he disappeared behind a stand of trees. Then they turned to each other, their voices low and excited. They promised to meet again, to train, to practice journaling and breathing exercises. They talked about focus drills and dry fire practice. For the first time, they spoke less about gear and more about skill. Chuck drove away on a quiet road that wound through pines and fields. He thought about the moments that had shaped him. The heat of the desert, the cold of the Arctic, the silence of long nights on guard. He recalled friends lost and lessons learned. He looked at that notebook on the passenger seat and smiled. It held memories of every shot he had ever made. He reached his house as afternoon light filtered through tall windows. He parked and carried the case inside. The walls were lined with shelves holding old gear helmets, patches, maps. Each item told its own story. He set the rifle down carefully and walked to a wooden desk. He opened the notebook and began to write. Not about the morning at the range, but about the feelings he had felt, the calm before the shot, the rhythm of breath and heartbeat. Wrote until the page was full. Outside, the day moved on. The sky shifted from bright blue to a soft haze. Birds called in the distance. Inside, Chuck closed his notebook and leaned back in his chair. He felt content. I had shared something more than skill that morning. He had shared a way to see and feel every shot, and he knew that the seeds of that lesson would grow in each of those shooters. Just as his own seed of focus had once been planted by another in a faraway land. The sun was low when Chuck Norris returned to the range, carried his rifle case and a small duffel bag. In the bag was a few journals, extra targets, and some simple tools for practice. The gravel crunched under his boots as he walked past. Empty stalls. A light breeze carried the smell of pine and earth. He felt calm, as if he were visiting old friends. A group of shooters waited near the benches. It was the same team who had watched him before. Not the easy smiles of amateurs. Their rifles leaned against the wooden rest, and beside them lay notepads and pens. Chuck nodded once, and they straightened. He set down his bag and opened it, pulling out extra paper targets, small squares of white with black circles. He placed them on metal frames. Today we work on breathing, Chuck said quietly. The group nodded. They remembered his words about calm mind, clear shot. He picked up a journal and handed it to the tall man. Write down what you feel before each shot, he said. Then he moved downrange a few steps and marked the firing line with chalk. The men and women spread out behind the line, each taking a spot. Chuck demonstrated first. He stood easily, feet shoulder-width apart. He raised the rifle, then let it rest on his shoulder. His left hand supported the forearm. His right hand gripped the stock firmly. He closed his eyes for a moment, inhaled deeply, and exhaled slowly. He opened his eyes, aimed with the iron sights, and squeezed the trigger. The shot rang out, and the target shivered, lowered the rifle, and exhaled again, relaxed. One of the women, Maria, frowned as she watched. You're breathing. It looks too slow, she said. Chuck shook his head. It must feel slow. You need to slow yourself, not hurry. He handed her a small notepad. Count your breaths. 1 for inhale, 1 for exhale. Keep it steady. Maria nodded and stepped forward. She took her rifle, mimicked his stance, and closed her eyes. She drew in air, then let it out, counting softly. She opened her eyes, aimed, and fired. The bullet struck the paper just above the black circle. She smiled shyly. That was better. Chuck gave a small nod. Behind her, the tall man tried. His first shot thudded too low. Frowned, looked at Chuck, then adjusted his breathing slower. He fired again and hit closer to the center ring. He brought his rifle down, eyes shining. I feel calmer, he said. Chuck smiled briefly and said, Good. Calm as your friend. They spent the next hour practicing slow breathing, each shot followed by a note in their journals. How they felt, where the bullet landed, what they did. Sometimes the shots clustered. Chuck moved from person to person, offering quiet advice. Relax your shoulders. Keep your trigger finger light. Don't think of the target, think of your breathing. His voice was steady, warm, never harsh. As the sun dipped lower, Chuck called a break. He handed out bottles of water and pointed to a small table under a shade. The shooters gathered there, scribbling in their journals, sipping water, talking. In low voices about their results, the tall man showed his pages. 2 clusters of hits, 1 tight, 1 wide. A woman named Lisa shook her head. My breathing slipped when I heard the shot echo, she admitted. Chuck nodded. Echo can distract you. Practice with just pretend shots. Dry fire, no bullets. Hear the click. Note your reaction. They returned to the line for dry fire practice. Chuck watched as each person took aim and squeezed a dry trigger. They worked through the echo of their own click. Chuck heard a few whispers of frustration, but he told them, every noise is part of the range. Learn it. He encouraged them to close their eyes between shots, feel the rifle settle, then aim. Reminded them of the desert nights in the winter cold times when every sound meant danger or safety. They listened as if tasting each word. After dry fire, Chuck invited them to try real shots again. They lined up and took turns. This time, their clusters tightened. One by one, they hit near the center rings. Maria landed 3 in a row within half an inch of each other. The tall man split the black circle twice. Lisa found her calm and scored a near-perfect grouping. They grinned at each other, excited. By their progress, Chuck silently marked their scores on a small chart. The sky had turned pink when Chuck called time. He gathered the group in a circle. They sat on the benches, rifles resting at their feet. The tall man stood and spoke first. "Thank you," he said, voice steady. "We came here confident in our gear, but you taught us it's more than tools. It's mind, body, and breath." Others nodded. One said, "I never kept notes before. Now I see how each feeling matters." Chuck listened, then said, "You all did well? Remember this feeling, focus without rush? Practice it every day, even without rifles." He stood, picked up his duffel bag, and zipped it closed. The group rose too. The tall man held out his hand. Chuck shook it, and the man said, "Will you come back?" Chuck paused, then smiled gently. "I'll return next month," he said. "Till then, keep your journals, your breathing, and your focus." He shouldered his bag and began walking. To his car, they watched him go, the last light of sunset glinting on his case. Behind them, the targets bore fresh clusters of holes. Journals lay open on the benches, pages filled with notes and drawings. The shooters stood together, talking about the next sessions, already planning to change their routines. Drove down the quiet road. He thought of the day's lessons. He remembered the echo of guns in empty valleys and the hush of snow underfoot. He felt the weight of the past decades of training, nights of waiting, moments when every breath had counted. Yet he felt light. Teaching others had reminded him of his own first days. He had learned from mistakes, practiced his breath, and found calm in chaos. He reached home just as the stars began to appear. He parked and carried his bag inside. On his desk lay the journals he used. He opened a fresh page and wrote the date. Then he wrote about the group's progress, their eager faces, the tightening clusters of hits. He wrote about their breathing, their focus, and how they had come together to learn. He closed the notebook and stood by the window. The stars shimmered in the dark sky. He thought of the range of simple iron sights and measured breaths. He whispered to himself, "Focus, breathe, learn." Then he switched off the lamp and walked to bed, ready to rest before the next sunrise and another chance to teach the art of calm and the power of practice. The morning air felt cool as Chuck Norris returned to the shooting range. He carried only his rifle case and a small cloth bag filled with chalk and simple tools. Behind him, the sky was pale blue, and the pine trees whispered in a gentle breeze. The group of shooters waited by the benches, their notebooks open. Eager eyes fixed on Chuck. They had grown from mocking amateurs into determined learners. Chuck laid out 3 wooden frames downrange. On each frame, he clipped a small paper target. One was flat and still, one swung slowly on a rope, and the third rotated on a low axle. He explained that today they would learn to handle change wind and movement, told them to focus not just on breathing but on seeing the target's motion and the air around them. He began with the swinging target. It moved in a slow arc, left to right. Chuck raised his rifle, settled his stance, and watched the swing for a few moments. Then he timed his breathing with the rhythm of the target. On the moment it paused at the center, he breathed out slowly and squeezed the trigger. The shot rang out, and the bullet struck dead center. The paper fluttered as the hole pierced its heart. The shooters stared. The tall man stepped forward, rifle in hand, and mimicked Chuck's timing. He inhaled as the target moved away, exhaled as it returned, and fired on the pause. The shot hit high but close. We frowned and tried again. The second shot hit nearer. The center. Chuck nodded and said, "Feel the rhythm. Match your breath to the movement." Maria watched carefully. She tapped the side of her rifle. She tried once and missed, then thought about her breathing and fired again. Her bullet grazed the edge of the paper. She wrote in her journal, "Missed when I rushed. Need more calm." Chuck smiled and reminded her that every miss was a lesson. They practiced swinging targets until each shooter landed a hit. Chuck walked among them, noting flaws, trigger squeezed too firm, shoulder tens, and offered quiet tips. He showed them how to adjust their grip. A softer hold allowed the rifle to follow the swing. He reminded them of the desert and the frozen night, times when the wind had howled and nothing stood still. Next, he turned to the rotating target, spun slowly on its axle, making a full circle in 10 seconds. The shooters looked uncertain. 2 at a time, they stepped forward. Chuck demonstrated again. He watched for a small pause as the target's edge faced him, breathed, and fired. The bullet cut the paper near the edge. He reloaded, aimed at the center, and fired again. The 2 shots formed a straight line along the curve. The tall man tried the same. His first shot flew too early. He blinked in surprise. Chuck said softly, "Wait for the pause. Trust the moment." With that, the man steadied his breath and tried again. The bullet hit almost on the edge of the circle. He pumped his fist in triumph. As they worked, Chuck spoke of focus and sacrifice. He told them how in his past, every mission had moved fast and changed without warning. He had to learn to slow his mind, to feel the world's rhythm even when it tried to break him. The shooters listened as if hearing a tale from an old friend, their respect growing with each word. After the rotating target, Chuck brought out a small hand fan. He waved it gently at the range. "Feel the wind," he said. "See how it moves the leaves? Every pellet and every bullet meets this same air. You must learn to read it." He set up a final paper target at 100 yards. He raised his rifle and took aim. Slight breeze rattled his shirt. He inhaled, exhaled, and fired. The shot hit just right of center, a half-inch from the bull's eye, marked the point with a small chalk dot. Then each shooter took their turn. They noticed the wind flickering their jackets and the leaves above. One woman hesitated, then fired. Too soon, hitting left of center. She frowned and wrote, "Wind blew me." Chuck pointed to the dot and said, "Use the wind. Aim a little upwind." She nodded and adjusted her aim. Her next shot landed on the chalk dot. They spent the rest of the morning reading wind shifts. Chuck showed them how to watch the grass, the flags, and even the smoke of their dry fire. Clicks. He taught them to wait for a brief calm the moment air settles, then breathe and fire. Their clusters tightened around the chalk dot. They cheered each other's success, no longer rivals but teammates. After a long session, Chuck called them together under the shade of a metal roof, handed out cold water, and encouraged them to rest. The notebooks lay full. Pages of numbers, sketches of wind, arrows, notes on breathing. They spoke eagerly about what they had learned. The tall man said, "I never thought wind could be part of the shot. I saw it only as noise," Maria added, "and movement I feared it. Now it feels like a dance." Chuck smiled and said, "Every target moves. Every day brings new winds. You must adapt." He reached into his cloth bag and pulled out a small mirror, he said. "Use this to see your sight picture. When you lift the rifle, look at the mirror. See the front sight and the target. If they align, you know your aim is true," he demonstrated. Then passed the mirror around. They practiced mirror drills until they felt the sight picture become clear. Each shooter learned to trust the tiny reflection as much as their own eyes. Chuck reminded them, "Tools help, but your mind must guide them. See clearly, breathe, trust yourself." As the clock hands moved past noon, Chuck said it was time for a final challenge. He set up all 3 targets still, swinging, rotating in a row. Each shooter would take 1 shot at each target in sequence, giving them just 5 seconds per shot. They would need to change their timing and aim quickly. The tall man went first. He breathed deeply, fired at the still target perfectly centered. He moved his aim to the swinging one, timed the pause, fired a good hit. He turned to the rotating target, counted the spin, fired a hit near the edge. The group clapped as he raised his hand in triumph. Maria followed. Her shots rang true, each one better than the last. Lisa, the woman who had struggled with echo, fired carefully, ignoring the ringing sounds, and landed 2 hits and a close miss. Even the quietest shooter surprised herself with a steady first hit. They all laughed with relief and joy as they completed the sequence. Chuck watched them with pride. He saw their growth from mocking beginners to skilled marksmen who could read movement and wind. He reminded them of the day's lesson. Change is the only constant. The target moves, the wind shifts, your mind wanders. You must adapt, refocus, and breathe. He packed up the targets in chalk. The shooters cleaned their rifles, wiped sweat from their brows, and wrote final thoughts in their notebooks. They thanked Chuck again and again. He told them he would return next week, but encouraged them to practice alone until then. As Chuck walked away from the range, he reflected on the day. He thought of battles where the ground shook and winds howled. He remembered nights when only the cold and his heartbeat surrounded him. He knew that teaching others to adapt was as important as any mission he had ever done. He reached his car as the sun climbed high, loaded his case, and drove home along a quiet road. Birds sang in the trees, and the breeze followed him like a friend. He thought of the students' determined faces and their pages full of notes. He knew their journey was just beginning. At home, he placed his rifle on a rack and poured a glass of water, sat by a window, watched the pines sway, and opened his notebook. He wrote down the day's progress, the lesson of movement and wind. Then he closed the cover and smiled. He felt content, knowing he had given others the gift of focus, adaptability, and calm. Night would come soon, and tomorrow would bring new winds. But for now, Chuck rested, readying himself for the next chance to teach, chance to learn. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the shooting range as Chuck Norris gathered the last of the gear. The targets he had set up that morning had served their purpose. They bore clusters of holes, neat and spread, each mark a testament to the day's lessons. Chuck folded the paper targets carefully and placed them in his cloth bag. He wiped the chalk marks from the wooden frames and stacked them by the range shed. The air smelled of spent gunpowder and warm pine. Soft breeze stirred the pages of the shooters' forgotten notebooks on the benches. One by one, the group approached Chuck. They carried their rifles with a new respect, their shoulders squared and their eyes steady. Their notebooks were full of notes, sketches, breath counts, wind arrows, and chalk dots. Maria stepped forward first, her cheeks flushed with excitement. "Sir," she said, her voice warm, "I hit the rotating target on the first try. This morning, I never thought I could do it." She held out her notebook so he could see the neat circle she had drawn around her grouping. Chuck smiled and nodded, tapping the page with a fingertip. "You trusted your focus," he said softly. "You let the movement guide you, and you found the moment." The tall man, whose laughter had filled the air on Chuck's first day here, stood next, clutching his own journal. He flipped through pages of early scatterings and later tight clusters. "I stopped blaming the rifle," he said, and started trusting my own breath. "It feels different, more honest." Chuck reached out and patted his shoulder. "Honesty in each shot," he replied. "That is the heart of marksmanship." Lisa, who had once been distracted by every echo, smiled shyly as she offered her notebook. On her pages, faint sketches of leaves and flags marked wind direction. Beside them, notes about shoulder tension and trigger pressure. "I learned to watch the grass," she said, "not just the target. When I saw the leaves still, I knew when to fire." Chuck examined her notes. "You read the air," he said. "That gives you power over every shot." A younger man with wire-rimmed glasses stepped forward. He had struggled at first, his groups wide and his breathing fast. But now his pages showed improvement, said quietly. "I still miss sometimes, but now I see why. I can try again." "With purpose." Chuck smiled at him. "Purpose in every attempt," he said. "That will carry you farther than luck ever could." The group circled around Chuck as he stood with his rifle case slung over his shoulder and the cloth bag at his feet. He looked at each person in turn, seeing their pride and their hunger to learn more. He felt the warmth of a teacher who had given something valuable. He remembered his own first lessons, shaky hands, missed shots, and a mentor who had taught him to breathe, to look for the wind, to trust his mind as much as his eye. He straightened and took a deep breath, the kind he had taught them so many times. The midday heat had softened into a gentle glow, and the pine needles rustled with a whisper. "You have done well," he said. "But remember, every day on the range is different. The wind will shift, the light will change, and you will face new challenges. Keep your journals, keep practicing, and never lose that calm focus." They nodded eagerly. One of the women asked, "Sir, what is the most important thing you learned from your past missions?" Chuck paused, looking down the empty line of targets as if he could still hear echoes of distant deserts and frozen plains. Then he turned back with a steady gaze. "I learned that every moment matters," he said. "Every choice, every breath, every shot. And that the greatest danger is not outside, but inside, when your mind forgets to be still." The shooters absorbed his words, feeling their truth. They gathered their notepads and rifles, careful to keep the lessons close. Chuck watched them pack up, noticing how they handled their rifles, now not as mere tools, but as extensions of their own will and focus. He saw them carry their notebooks like treasures, knowing that within those pages lay the path to greater skill. When the last rifle was stowed in its case, and the notebooks tucked away, Chuck turned to leave. The range officer, who had watched silently from the safety booth, came forward with 2 cold bottles of water. She handed one to Chuck. He accepted it with a nod of thanks. "They'll talk about today for weeks. Thank you for sharing your knowledge." Chuck shook his head gently. "They shared it with each other," he said. "I only showed them the way." Lifted the bottle to his lips and took a long drink. The water was crisp and cool, a welcome relief after the day's work. The shooters stood nearby, not wanting to intrude, but reluctant to see him go. Finally, the tall man broke the silence. "Will we see you again?" he asked. The others echoed the question, voices hopeful. Chuck smiled kindly. "I will return next month for another session," he said. "Until then, you have homework. Keep breathing, keep noting, and keep learning." He tapped his temple lightly. "Your mind is your greatest asset." With that, he hoisted his rifle case onto his shoulder and slung his cloth bag across his back. He walked toward the exit, stepping lightly over the gravel. The group fell in behind him, matching his pace. They reached the gate together, and Chuck paused to look back at the range one last time. Benches were empty, save for a lone notebook left open. The target stood silent and still in the distance. He felt a calm satisfaction settle in his chest. He had given them more than technique. He had given them confidence, focus, and respect for the quiet power within. He remembered his own first day on a range just like this, when he had felt both fear and possibility, and a teacher had shown him how to find stillness amid the noise. Chuck turned back to the group and said, "Remember this feeling, pride? In progress, not perfection. Celebrate each small step, and you will build the skills that last." He nodded once, and then he walked away. The long shadows stretching before him, the shooters watched until he disappeared down the path. Then they turned to each other, speaking in excited whispers. They made plans to meet again, to test new drills, to share successes and challenges. They spoke of breath counts, dry fire practice, wind studies, and journal checks. They carried with them the lessons of movement, of calm, and of true marksmanship. As Chuck's figure faded among the pines, he felt the gentle wind on his face. He lifted his chin and inhaled deeply, savoring the scent of pine and earth. He closed his eyes. For a moment, breathed out and smiled. Then he opened his eyes and stepped onto the road that led home, ready for whatever lessons tomorrow might bring.